Chapter 6 of The Tower of London by Arthur Poyser. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, All Hallows Barking by the Tower, Part 2. East End. The 18th century monument that partially hides the windows at the east end of the north aisle covers the tomb of Thomas Gordon of Tower Liberty, who, according to the inscription, had the singular felicity to command esteem, confidence, and affection in the tender and more delicate connections of private life. But his is certainly the misfortune to be remembered by as ugly and depressing a memorial as could be imagined. Even in the year of its erection, a vestry minute records that the monument now erecting for the late Mr. Gordon is a nuisance. In Machen's Diary, 1556, it is stated that on the 6th day of September was buried at Barking Church Mr. Philip Dennis, Squire, with coat of arms. This Dennis coat of arms may still be seen, now somewhat time-worn, on the wall between the Gordon monument and the altar. The beautiful and softly toned stained glass of the east window is modern. The work of Mr. J. Clayton, it commemorates the incumbency of Dr. Mason, the first head of the present College of Clergy attached to this church. The altar-piece beneath, heavy in design and gloomy in effect, is an example of the art of 1686. Some elaborate carving is hidden beneath the coverings and frontal of the communion table. It is an excellent example of the skilful workmanship in wood that has been to some extent neglected since the days of Gibbons. For many years the brass altar rails erected in 1750 were so blackened by neglect that they were often mistaken for rails of old wood. By their individual gracefulness when examined at close quarters, and yet solid appearance when viewed from the nave, these beautiful rails form one of the most striking adornments of the building. Clergy Vestry. Permission to enter this room should be obtained from the sacristan, who will show the many interesting documents treasured there. On the wall to the right as one enters the room hangs an excellent painting of Dr. Gaskarth, 27th vicar, who was appointed in 1686. A highly popular vicar, generous and of firm but conciliatory manners. Under his auspices the church was twice thoroughly repaired. He was vicar for 46 years and died in 1732, aged 86. Those who have an interest in such matters are recommended to read the beautiful Latin lines inscribed in the registers where, under the date December 1, 1703, Dr. Gaskarth records the burial of his wife. On the wall to the left of the entrance there are two interesting old maps, the lower one, which is more of a picture than a map, giving an excellent idea of the appearance of London before the fire, and the small one, higher on the wall, a representation of All Hallows standing almost alone on Tower Hill, before the parish consisted of more than a few rows of cottages. This is the valuable Gascoigne survey made in 1597. On the wall to the left of the fireplace will be found a key plan to all the tombs, brasses, and memorials of the church, placed here through the instrumentality of the then churchwarden, Mr. Henry Urquhart. Would that earlier churchwardens had taken like interest in the place, and left us such plans of the building in their day. From the windows of the vestry there is to be had a glimpse of the graveyard, somewhat depressing, with its many ancient and fast-decaying tomb monuments and headstones. The registers of the church, stored in an iron room opening off this vestry, contains much that is of very great interest, and time spent in their examination will not be lost. There are 13 books, the first beginning in 1558, with the accession of Queen Elizabeth, and extending to 1650. Taking the baptisms first, we are reminded that before the beginning of the records now remaining there was, about the year 1555, the christening ceremony of the famous Bishop Andrews, a native of this parish, in the church. As the bishop constantly prayed for All Hallows Barking, where I was baptized, this fact is beyond dispute, though the actual entry is lost. In 1609 we come upon the name of Francis, son of Sir James Bourchier, knight, under February 5. Bourchier was father-in-law of Oliver Cromwell, and a city merchant of considerable importance. He possessed an estate at Felsted in Essex, and a town house beside Tower Hill, then a favourite residence of the lesser aristocracy. In 1616 we find that a son of Sir William Apsley, Lieutenant of the Tower, was baptized here, showing the close connection that has always existed between this church and the Tower. But the most interesting of all the entries is that against October 23, 1644, when William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, was brought to the font at All Hallows. His father, an officer of high rank in the Navy, at that time dwelt upon the east side of Tower Hill, within a court adjoining to London Walk, and William, his eldest son, was born within that house, now demolished, within Tower Liberties. It is worth while to note that it was not until quite late in the 18th century that double Christian names were given to children brought to baptism. With regard to marriages, the register begins in 1564, and in 1650 there is a curious entry, under March 28, which states that "a couple being married went away, and gave not their names." In 1763 Samuel Parr, father of the celebrated Dr. Parr, married Margaret Cox of this parish, spinster. This Margaret was the daughter of Dr. Cox, formerly head master of Harrow School. Another interesting entry is that referring to John Quincy Adams, afterwards sixth President of the United States, who was 30 years old when, on July 26, 1797, he married Louisa Catherine Johnson of this parish. Judge Jeffreys also married his first wife here, but the entry has disappeared. The burial register is most remarkable of all. In 1563, a plague year, there were no less than 284 burials, mostly women and children, and nearly 22,000 people died in that year in London alone. Other periods of plague and consequent excessive mortality were the years 1582, 1593, 1625, and 1665. In 1625, 394 persons died in this parish, being 6 times the average mortality. The calendar of state papers for this year contains a record of a petition from the minister and churchwardens of All Hallows Barking, praying that some part of the cloth for mourning for the late king, distributed among the poor of divers parishes of London, may be given to this parish, one of the poorest within the city walls and sorely visited by the plague. The plague of 1665, most disastrous of a long series, is too well known from sundry descriptions to need more than mere mention here. Before the earliest date in this book of burials there was placed in the graveyard of Barking Church the headless body, very indecently interred, of Bishop Fisher, executed on the East Smithfield side of Tower Hill in 1535. Reference has already been made to Fisher in connection with his imprisonment in the Bell Tower, and the removal of his body, after it had lain for some time in this churchyard, to St. Peter's on Tower Green. Another victim of Henry VIII.'s wrath, Henry Howard, the poet Earl of Surrey, was in 1547 buried beside the church after a mock trial and subsequent execution on Tower Hill. His remains also were removed and taken in 1614 to Framlingham in Suffolk. Lord Thomas Grey, brother of the Duke of Suffolk and uncle of Lady Jane Grey, was headed on Tower Hill April 28, 1554, and buried in All Hallows Barking. In Queen Mary's luckless reign, a plot to rob the Queen's exchequer was discovered and the leaders sent to the Tower. Machin's diary thus records the event. On the 8th day of July, Henry Peckham and John Daniel were hanged on Tower Hill. Their bodies were cut down and headed, the heads carried to London Bridge, and the bodies buried in Barking Church. Continuing our inspection of the burial register, we come upon the most interesting entry of all. Under the date January 11, 1644, we read, "William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury, beheaded." The last word has been almost erased. We can but conjecture that the word was traitor, and that some later hand scratched out all but the initial letter. But why was that letter left if every trace of so hateful a word was to be obliterated? Laud was buried in the vicar's vault under the altar, but his body was taken to St. John's College, Oxford, in 1663. Laud's body, being accompanied to the grave with great multitudes of people who in love or curiosity or remorse of conscience had gathered together, was decently interred in Allhallows Barking, and had the honour of being buried in that church in the form provided by the Common Prayer Book, after it had been long disused and almost reprobated in most of the churches in London. Some earlier entries in this register are of sufficient interest to attract attention. During 1560 there is a curious reference to the burial of a poor starved callous man, which may mean a callousman, a beggar, or a destitute refugee from Calais, which had been lost to England 2 years earlier. In 1591, 1596, and 1599 there were buried in the church 2 sons and a daughter of the famous Robert, Earl of Essex, favourite of Elizabeth, which earl possessed a house in Seething Lane in this parish. Entries regarding persons of less fame, but surely of considerable interest to us as suggesting the state of the poor at that time, occur in the 17th century. One is a poor soldier dying in the streets in the night, whose name was unknown, February 18, 1606. Another is a poor boy that died in the streets, 1620, and yet another is one unknown, starved on Tower Hill, January 15, 1627. With the entries for January 1 and 2, 1644, we are introduced to the period of the Civil War, during which time Tower Hill was the scene of frequent executions, and Allhallows Barking received the headless bodies of many of the victims. Against the dates just mentioned there are the names of John Hotham, Esquire, beheaded for betraying his trust to the State, and Sir John Hotham, Knight, beheaded for betraying his trust to the Parliament. Sir John Hotham and his son were beheaded in consequence of a design to deliver up Hull to the King, which place they held for the Parliamentary forces. With these melancholy entries we may place another, of the 17th day of the following June, which records the burial of Dorothy, daughter of Sir John Hotham, Knight, and the Lady Elizabeth his wife, and tells of the passing away of the grief-stricken child, who desired to be buried here with her father. On April 23, 1650, the entry "Colonel Andrews, beheaded, buried in the chancel," refers to Colonel Eusebius Andrews, an old loyalist condemned to suffer as a traitor. He was beheaded on Tower Hill, dying with much firmness and courage. On leaving the vestry we may notice, behind the door leading into the church, a recently discovered and much damaged piscina, or place of ablution for the priests serving at the altar. This was accidentally found when the walls were stripped of their plaster in 1904. From its position it would lead one to suppose that the altar rails were at one time carried along on the top of the present altar steps, but of this we have no conclusive proof. The best view of the interior of the church is to be obtained from this standpoint. The high pitch of the excellently restored roof, the grace and lightness of the chancel pillars, as contrasted with the massiveness of those in the nave, the imposing appearance of the handsome organ case, all these striking features will leave one of the most lingering impressions of the building as a whole, apart from its interest in detail, with those who pause here as before a remarkable picture. On the easternmost pillar of the chancel there will be noticed the memorial to John Kettlewell, the celebrated non-juror who died in 1695, and by his own desire was buried in the same grave where Archbishop Laud was before interred. His funeral rites were solemnized by Bishop Ken, who read the burial office, and the whole evening service at Allhallows Barking on the occasion. Ken, deprived of his see, thus for the last time exercised his ministry within the Church of England. South Aisle. Beneath the window at the east end of this aisle, the Colleton monument, from the chisel of Schneemakers, almost rivals its neighbour in the north aisle by its heavy dulness, but the altar tomb against the south wall is an early monument worthy of careful examination. Like the Croke altar tomb already described, it dates back to the 15th century, and is the more ancient of the two. A gilt brass plate at the back of the tomb is graven with a representation of the Resurrection. It is not now possible to ascertain to whose memory the tomb was erected. Possibly it commemorates the founder of a chantry chapel attached to this chancel aisle. The beautifully carved font cover, executed in whitened wood, not plaster as many suppose, is the work, and some think the masterpiece, of Grinling Gibbons, whose incomparable works of art, the carving of fruit and flowers and decorative scroll-work in wood, are to be seen in other parts of this church, in other city churches, and in many a manor house and ancient hall throughout England. This font cover will repay the most careful study. Gibbon's signature, so to speak, may be found in the split pea-pod near the feet of one of the figures. The brasses in this aisle are of singular interest. The elaborate brass near the altar tomb, with its ornamental border, is a 1546 memorial to William X, one of the masters of the household under Henry VIII. He was the first to edit a complete edition of Chaucer's works, to show that England had her classics as well as other nations. When this brass was taken up and restored in 1861, it was found to be engraved on both sides. The supposition is that at the dissolution of the monasteries, when many treasures found their way into the markets, as one writer puts it, with just a touch of cynicism, a large brass, which had covered the tomb of some dignitary of the Church, was cut down to the size of the figures we see on this Tyne slab, and the back of the former engraving became the front of the present one. Tyne married Anne, daughter of William Bond, Esquire, of the city of London, who now lies by his side. He left 3 daughters and one infant son, Francis, who became a distinguished antiquarian, and held the office of Lancaster Herald. The extreme youth of this child prevented his inheriting his father's prestige at court, which in consequence descended to his nephews, one of whom was Sir John Tyne of Longleat, founder of the noble house of Bath. The small circular brass, 1389, near by, bearing an inscription in Norman French, is the oldest in the city, and records the resting place of William Tong, a generous benefactor to All Hallows in the 14th century. The larger ruche brass, laid down in 1498, has had its precatory invocation erased by the overzealous Puritans, but is otherwise in good preservation. The engraving is rough and bold. The details of the costume are true to contemporary drawings of the period, and the position of the dog will recall what was said with regard to the tracings on the Verby stone on the north aisle. Farther west lies the Rawson brass, dated 1518, also mutilated by the iconoclasts of the mid-17th century. The central figure is that of Christopher Rawson, freeman of the ancient guild of the Mercers, and the other figures represent Margaret and Agnes, his wives. In his will he mentions a chantry in the chapel of St. Anne in the church of All Hallows, Barking, where prayers for his own soul and the souls of his wives and children were to be said. Canon Mason, in an article which appeared in the 19th Century for May 1898, says, "From a theological point of view, this is perhaps the most interesting monument in the church. From the mouths of the 3 figures issue scrolls, which unite over their heads in an invocation to the Blessed Trinity. But these scrolls are in one respect unique. Reference is made to the wording of the scrolls. Salva nos, libera nos, and justificat nos, O Beata Trinitas. Save us and deliver us are, of course, expressions common enough. Vivificat nos, quicken us, occurs in a similar context in medieval services, but search may be made without finding anywhere else, I believe, in liturgical formulas or in sepulchral inscriptions, another example of justify us." In the year 1518 the controversies about justification raised on the Continent by Luther had not begun to convulse England, and indeed Rawson's invocation takes no side in the controversy. He does not say whether he hopes to be justified by faith or justified by works, but he has laid hold upon the long-forgotten word, and craves that the blessing contained in it, whatever that might consist of, may be given to him and to his wives. The Bassano slab of 1624 lies above one of the king's servants, and the adjoining tomb of Dame Anne Masters, who died in 1719, records the wife of Sir H. Masters, city alderman, and mother of 19 children, which goodly company of descendants occupy much burial space round the Rawson tomb. On one of the pillars of this aisle a sadly dilapidated brass plate commemorates William Armour, Governor of the Pages of Honour to Henry VIII., Edward VI., Mary, and Elizabeth, who died in 1560. His wife's burial is entered in the registers against May 1st, 1563. She is the lady to whom, according to the privy purse expenses of Henry VIII., payments were made for cambric and making the king's shirts. The daily services of the church were continued in this aisle without intermission during the progress of the work of restoration. Choir. As we walk back towards the east end and turn into the choir portion of the chancel, we may notice 2 quaint semicircular seats at the foot of the pillars on the altar steps. These forms were made out of the wood of the old roof, removed in 1814. The choir stalls of solid oak are comparatively recent additions to the building, and bear some fine carving representing the fellowship of the angelic with the animal world. These stalls are constructed to accommodate the clergy of the Mission College of All Hallows, Barking, as well as the members of the choir. The seat of the warden of the college and vicar of the parish is that which faces east. In mentioning the vicar and clergy, we may here fitly recall many of the men who have served at the altar of All Hallows, and whose names have not been lost to fame. There is preserved a tabular list of the vicars since the presentation to the living of William Collis on March 2nd, 1387. Chatterton, 13th vicar, was, as we have already seen, appointed Dean of the Free Chapel of Barking by Richard III. Carter, appointed in 1525, was a friend of Wolsey's, and resigned in the year of the Cardinal's fall, 1530. Dawes, 1542 to 1565, was the first Protestant incumbent, and possessed many of the attributes of the Vicar of Bray, as sketched in the verses of the old song. Wood, 1584-1591, was the first vicar appointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Rivas, vicar from 1591 to 1598, was one of the translators of the present authorized version of the Bible, as was also his successor at All Hallows, Dr. Tighe. The 25th vicar, Edward Layfield, appointed in 1635, was a nephew of Archbishop Laud. Layfield was deprived in 1642, by an ordinance of the House of Commons, under circumstances of considerable barbarity. He was interrupted during the performance of divine service, dragged out of church while the walls of the old church resounded to the shrieks of an infuriated mob within and without the building, set on a horse with his surplice not removed, the common prayer book tied around his neck, and in this manner forced to ride through the city. Then he was thrown into prison, and no provision made for his maintenance whatever. Layfield was restored to his living on the return of Charles II. His contemporaries describe him as a man of generous and noble spirit, great courage and resolution, and much respected in his parish, though a high churchman. Vicar during the plague and fire, he died in 1680, and was buried here in the chancel. Dr. Hickes, appointed in 1681, was one of the most remarkable and highly educated men of his generation, and on the accession of William and Mary refused to take the oaths, was deprived of all his preferments, and became a non-juror. He was a friend of Pepys, and that volatile product of the Restoration period often lamented Dr. Hicks's long and dull sermons. Hicks attended Pepys as he lay on his deathbed, and many references to this vicar of Allhallows will be found in the diary. The present body of mission clergy attached to the church have their college in Trinity Square on Tower Hill. They do excellent work for the church at large, travel to all parts of England constantly, and to far parts of the world occasionally, to preach and conduct missions. In this way the revenue of Allhallows, a seemingly large sum to the man in the street, who usually remains there to scoff at useless city churches, is taken up to the last penny for this most valuable and useful work. The college was established in 1883, and many men known far and wide for their work in the church, I may instance Dr. Collins, now Bishop of Gibraltar, have been members of it. Its first head was Dr. A. J. Mason, now Master of Pembroke College, Cambridge, to whom Allhallows is indebted for the restoration of the north porch and the gift of the upper schoolroom. His successor, the present warden, Dr. Arthur W. Robinson, has since carried on the arduous duties of the college, and has brought all departments of the work in connection with Allhallows as a parish church up to a point of remarkable efficiency. Never was the old building more zealously served than it is now, and never has it been better used by parishioners and by others whose daily work lies in the city. A numerous congregation, consisting of those who come up from the eastern suburbs by the early trains and have an hour to spare before beginning work, assembles here every weekday morning at 8 o'clock. The service consists of prayers, a hymn, a short address, and an organ recital. The Sunday congregations are large for a city church, especially in the evenings, and on 2 or 3 occasions during the year the church is crowded beyond the actual seating capacity, an inspiring sight when viewed from the organ loft. Chancel and Nave. In the chancel between the choir stalls may be seen the James brass of 1591, with figure about 3 feet in length, also the brass of 1612 to Mary, wife of John Bernal, merchant. Bernal presented a communion table to the church in 1613. The last brass, but the most famous and artistic of all, is that large square sheet of Latin which is set in the pavement to the west of the litany desk. It dates back to 1530, and is a memorial of Andrew Evangar, citizen and salter, and Ellen his wife. The Puritan defacements are only too plain, yet in spite of this it is possible to decipher the beaten-out lettering which ran, "Of your charity pray for the souls of —— on whose souls Jesu have mercy. Amen." This brass is one of the finest specimens of Flemish workmanship in England. Its only rivals are brasses at Ipswich and St. Albans. It is unnecessary to describe it in detail. It can best be studied from the framed rubbing which stands behind the choir screen in the south aisle. The very fine Jacobean pulpit was erected before England had a single colony. There it has stood during the rise of the British Empire, and it has survived many a storm in Church and State. Though the pulpit dates back to 1613, the sounding board above was erected in 1638, and is termed in the vestry minutes of that year the new pulpit head. This sounding board is inscribed on each of its sides with the motto "Extem pedicum crucifixum," which reminds us that whether the preacher in that pulpit looks south or east or west, his one subject is to be Christ crucified. The fine sword rests rising above the choir screen behind the vicar's stall were erected by successive Lord Mayors, and bear their respective crests with the city coat of arms. The one on the south side, the smallest of the 3, was erected in 1727 by Lord Mayor Iles. That in the centre commemorates the mayoralty of Slingsby Bethel, Esquire, in 1755, while the remaining one was put up in 1760, when Sir Thomas Chitty, a parishioner of Allhallows, was appointed chief citizen. After examining the graceful ironwork of these sword rests, the delicate wrought iron design beneath the pulpit rail should by no means be passed over. The choir screen itself, as well as the screens behind the churchwarden's pews at the back of the church, is worthy of study by all who are interested in old wood carving. West End. From north to south porch until the 1904 restoration, there extended an ugly, heavy gallery, which made the entrance to the church from either side very gloomy. Now the former organ loft is rebuilt, and the interior of the church by this alteration regains the open appearance of earlier times. In the entrance chamber of the tower there is preserved a very fine leaden water cistern, on which appear the date 1705 and the letters A.H.B., the monogram of the church, while in the tower itself there hangs a peal of finely toned bells, 8 in number, which in 1813 replaced the bells hung in 1659 when the present tower was new. The first organ in this church was that one already spoken of, built by Anthony Duddington in 1519. Though all trace of this very early instrument is lost, the original indenture still remains. Dr. Hopkins says this is the earliest known record of the building of an organ in England. In 1675-77 the present organ case was erected by Thomas and Renatus Harris, and the organ then consisted of grate and choir manuals only, but a third manual, the swell, was added in the 18th century. Hatton describes the organ case as he saw it in 1708 as enriched with fames and the figure of Time and Death carved in basso relievo and painted above. The organ was improved by Gerard Smith in 1720 and again in 1813. It was again overhauled and enlarged by Bunting in 1872 and 1878, was partially burnt in 1880, and restored, very badly indeed, in 1881. On Sunday, 3rd November 1907, during evensong, this ancient instrument broke down and was not used again. The choral services were sung by the choir, either entirely unaccompanied or supported by a pianoforte played in the chancel. The instrument is now being rebuilt by Messrs. Harrison and Harrison of Durham, and this well-known firm have the problem before them of preserving what is of historic interest in the old organ and incorporating that in the newer and more efficient mechanism of the organ of today. A complete list of organists of this church from 1676 to the present day has been preserved. The large and fully equipped music room in the northwest angle of the building is where the daily practices of the choristers are held. In addition to the fittings incidental to the work of the choir, it contains some interesting photos of the church and 2 old parish plans. The royal arms above the door, on the side of the organ loft, used in Georgian days to hang above the altar. A spacious music or schoolroom lies over the north porch, and this portion of the building, though modern, is quite in keeping with the ancient church to which it is attached. Of that old church we now take leave. Though great the history it has already made, there is perhaps as great a history for it yet to make. End of Chapter 6. End of the Tower of London, by Arthur Poyser.